welcome again, everyone. And I know this is being recorded to all of those who will be watching this at a later time. Welcome to Catholic Prison Ministry Coalition's Town Hall. As we hear from Dr. Sutton, who I'll introduce here in just a second, on the issue of incarceration for those with developmental disorders. We are going to be hearing from Dr. Sutton, but as always, towards the end of today's town hall, we'll have an opportunity for Q&A. So for those of you here now, feel free to just type in questions in the chat box as we go along, or write it down so that you don't forget. And then probably about a quarter till the hour, we will then begin to engage in Q&A. Well, my name is Father Dustin. I am a priest in the Diocese of Pensacola-Tallahassee. I also am the executive director at Joseph House and a board member of Catholic Prison Ministry Coalition, and am thrilled to be a part of tonight's discussion to hear from Dr. Sutton about his experiences, his insights as well. But first, let's begin with prayer. Good and gracious God, we thank you for the gift of life, the gift of community. We thank you for drawing us together this evening to reflect, to hear of all the insights and the wisdom that will be shared this evening. We pray that you would bless all of those here present, that you would bless their respective missions, their vocations, the work that they are doing. We pray that you would guide us this evening as we continue to reflect on how best to serve those that are most in need, and especially those that are experiencing incarceration. We pray all of this through Christ our Lord. Amen. Amen. And again, before we begin, just to feel free to start your videos, again, only if you're comfortable, but it allows for, I think, us to be able to kind of just get an awareness of those that are joining us. So feel free to start your videos, but again, no pressure if you are unable to do that as well. Well, Dr. Larry Sutton is zooming in with us from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Dr. Sutton is a psychologist who has been working particularly in the field of, for those on the spectrum with autism since the early 2000s, and has, through that experience, through that journey, came to experience and came to work with those that have developmental disabilities that are incarcerated around 2009, 2010, I believe. And we are, again, thrilled that this is the third part of a series. For those of you that are joining us that are just tuning in and have not seen the other previous two town hall meetings, feel free to go to CPMC's website where you will find those videos. So Dr. Sutton, the mic is all yours. And yeah, you'll have to unmute yourself, sorry.
Thank you. I didn't realize I was muted. Thank you. It's very much a thrill to be back, especially to present this third part of the series with looking at healthy relationships and some of the work that I've done over the course of the last approximately 20 years. Let me go. I'm going to share my screen again, and we'll begin with a PowerPoint. I think I'm a little bit more efficient with it than I was last session. I say that and it doesn't work. So thank you for coming back. Thank you for looking and trying to recognize some of these problems that individuals with a developmental disability might have. Just kind of as a refresher, I thought I might talk about really quickly some of the situations that I experienced when working with older adolescents. Winning a baseball game, what I learned from my father. I worked with a young man who was 15, 16 years old, and he was a very good athlete. He was in the spectrum. Unfortunately, and I'll give my first qualification here, some of these examples are rather graphic. So I apologize in advance about the nature of the first couple. And every time this young man would do successful in baseball at a game, having many hits, making a good play, his father and he would celebrate by his father performing oral or anal sex on him. Well, because his social judgment wasn't really good, this young man just thought that's the way that it is. And although it didn't feel particularly good to him, that's what you do when you celebrate something. He was arrested after he had done a similar activity to another peer after a successful athletic event, and was bewildered why he was in trouble because he did just what his father had done to him. Second example, she knows what I'm thinking. This is kind of like a theory of mind issue where you basically think that people know what you're thinking. In a private swimming pool where he lived, he saw one of the lifeguards who he was very attracted to. He was very attracted to women's breasts. And as he approached her, she smiled back at him. Well, that just acknowledged to him that she must know what I'm thinking. And he walked closer and she smiled and acknowledged him. He walked closer, kept smiling. And by the time he got up in front of her, he pulled down the top of her swimsuit and she screamed. Her boyfriend was there and chased him out of the swimming pool. He was so upset that he ran across the park that the pool was located in, and came across a couple of children that were close by. And he was still so frazzled at that point that he dropped his swimsuit. Nothing more, he just stood there. Well, of course, the children's parents got very upset and the police were involved and he ended up in one of my facilities. It was interesting with this particular young man because I'll make a reference to him at the end. Because of his being fixated so much, he had gone through the facility, had a very, very good adolescent sexual offender program. In fact, it was one of the better ones in the country for neurotypical individuals, if that makes any sense at all, non-autistic individuals. But he'd gone through it at that point 2 times. And part of it is that people never really knew for sure whether or not the man was safe or not safe. And so we came to the trial right before he was 21. Pennsylvania has another system for those that are considered still dangerous or worrisome at that point. Well, he came in front of the judge and he's had all the right questions, but I was nervous about him. So I said to him, we'll just say, John, if you found a woman that was attractive and you wanted to walk up to her or you wanted to have sexual relations with her, what would you do? Well, I'd ask her, and if she said no, I'd just walk away. Again, a good answer. But I knew him. So I said, John, what would you really do? Well, if I wanted to have relations with her and she said no, I would go to the drugstore, find a sleeping agent. I would give it to her. She would go to sleep and I would have sex with her because I knew he was somewhat worrisome. I'll make a comment about him at the end of the program if we have time. Was another young man, and I'm sorry about the type of cases, but they're actual real cases, making a friend. Many of the individuals that I met then in the prison, many of the people that I work with now, particularly adults, really have a difficult time knowing the process of making and keeping friends. Their social judgment in terms of what makes up a friend is often impaired because they so desperately want it that they don't really look at some of the other attributes that may be around. With this young man, for his age, he was 12, but he was a great big kid, wanted to have friends. And this group of boys said, well, if you want to be our friends, this is what we would like you to do. We want you to hold this other peer, who was a male peer, and they basically assaulted him. They all ran away when the police came, and he kind of just stood there, not knowing for sure what to do, and he was the one that was arrested. Finally, one other example real quick. I had a young man that had an IQ that was very near gifted range, which is close to 130 IQ. He too didn't know how to make friends, but desperately wanted them. And the facility that I was at had a very large campus. There were 3 different sets of treatment facilities on the grounds. It was surrounded by double razor wire, so it was very secure. What do they have access to that they could make weapons with? Well, this young man knew all kinds of things. I'm holding up what's left. This is 10 years old at this point, of a little rope that he made. He made it out of twirling toilet paper. And you can see it's fairly long. What he would do is he would attach Lego blocks to it. Or he would walk along the grounds and he would find a paper clip or a sliver of glass. He would do something because his friends all wanted to make friends, all wanted to be his friend, as long as they gave him some of those things that he made. And they would use them as shanks or other tools to hurt other people. He didn't recognize what they were doing or why they were doing it. Well, as a review for what's happened, I want to briefly describe what autism is again. It's a developmental disorder. So whether or not the parent of the individual knew it at the time, these symptoms were present from birth until probably age 5 or 6. A lot of time, if it's the firstborn of that couple, they don't know what's normal, what's typical, what's regular. And so some of the behaviors, aren't necessarily distinguishable as being unusual. It often affects language. It could be a delay in language. Typical language comes between around 12 months, give or take a couple of months. Small phrases or sentences, or by 18 months, give or take a couple of months. Or sometimes the language doesn't make any sense. They're saying a lot of words in response to whatever you may have asked, but it doesn't seem to make any sense, particularly to what you asked. And they're not aware that it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to it. At this point, all I would say for that problem is that it looks like the person has an expressive language disorder of some sort, or some sort of language disorder. However, the next 2 set of symptoms are more symbolic of somebody with autism. They have impaired socialization. They don't recognize social cues. They'll say things very bluntly. They don't have the ability to make or keep friends. They'll find somebody that they like a lot. They'll stand next to them, not recognizing boundaries as meaning anything. They'll interrupt their parents when they're trying to talk, when they're bored or want something. These types of symptoms. And the 4th one, finally, is repetitive behaviors and sensory concerns. Again, as a toddler, children play with lots of toys. Sometimes children with autism prefer to play with non-toy items like tools, or maybe just empty boxes. All kids play with empty boxes to make forts, but they seem to play with them exclusively rather than playing with the more conventional toys. And they seem to like that better. Or they take their regular toys, such as matchbox cars. They may line them up by size, color, model. They may turn the cars upside down and spin the wheels because they love to watch things spin. They may lay on their back and look up towards a ceiling fan and only leave when a parent picks them up to take them to another activity or something. They often have sensory concerns. They're very picky with food for the most part. They may like 4 or 5 foods, period. They won't try new food because of how it feels, how it smells, what it looks like. If there's a burnt spot on it, they tend to ignore it sometimes. They may have sensory problems with clothing, like the tags in the clothes. I think everybody has problems with tags in the clothes. In fact, it was such a problem that many manufacturers now have tagless shirts. Sometimes the seam on the shirts are problematic to them. When they go to put their shoes and socks on, if the socks aren't lined up right with the seam just right across the top of the toes, they get all bothered by that and won't put the shoes on so they won't end up going to school on time or they miss their school bus, things of that nature. Okay, and how does it impact life? Now, let me go back for just a second. When all these symptoms are taken as a whole, and they all happen before 5 or 6 years of your age, and there's not been a head trauma of any sort, there's not been a fever due to something like malaria or something of that nature, in all likelihood, the diagnosis is possibly going to fall in the autism spectrum. Conversely, if none of these symptoms seem to be present, if they had language at the typical time, if they could play with others and play with others' rules, and even for a little while, if they recognize from what you've said what they should do in certain situations and learn from it, if they don't seem to have many repetitive behaviors, and for the most part, there doesn't seem many sensory concerns, but these problems occur later in their elementary years, 9 or 10 years of age, or young teens, then it means something very different. So it's not autism then. So it may resemble it, it may look like it. It often gets confused with schizophrenia, which doesn't actually have its onset until middle teens, closer to 20 in many cases. It may look like a bipolar disorder, and is often diagnosed sometimes with that when they find something that they really like, they get really excited and they bounce up and jump and they act as if they're in a very manic type of a way, but they're not really. It's just the excitement that they have for something. If you've ever seen a child at church, for example, they begins to stim, flap their hands, bounce on their toes in front of the candles in church because of how nicely they're flickering, or they're looking and all of a sudden the sun comes out and goes through the stained glass window and they're just really excited, or they sing beyond the time that the singing in church from the organ stops, because they love the organ music and they just keep singing because they really like the melody and nobody else is singing. These are certain stims that more resemble somebody that's in the spectrum. Okay. Impact on life. One of the reasons we're here tonight, of course, is because of the legal issues. Sometimes they can get in trouble with the law, knowingly or unknowingly. Usually they're the victim of a designing other, or were taught by somebody that was close to them on doing bad things. They may not have known it at the time. They certainly discovered it after the fact. They have difficulty making meaningful relationships. Ironically, their best friends are typically their parents, because adults are often very good with younger children. And so they respond to them, or their siblings. When they get older, they relate much better, it seems, either to younger children or to still adults. However, when they're adults and they're expected to interact with adults, they don't know how. They don't trust it. And unfortunately, by the time they get to be teens, particularly those that may be in the higher functioning forms of autism, other things creep in as well, such as depression and anxiety. And so they worry about a lot of things, and they're desperate to make friends, and they're desperate to look and act and do the things that their peers do, but they don't have the skill sets necessary to do them. Because they don't have that interaction skills, they have a hard time interacting with the community. I don't know if you've noticed it, but I've noticed it a lot, that if you go out to the little leagues and you watch particularly the younger children, everybody in the outfield with the T-ball, and they spin around. They're looking at whatever because it's so boring out there. However, as they get a little bit older, you may have seen the child that refuses to do something. I can remember a very awkward situation for this young man and his family as we sat in the stands. He was the pitcher. He was a very good pitcher, but he was flustered. He was upset and he refused to pitch. In fact, he threw his glove down and he kind of just stood there as everybody on both teams were waiting to play. Variations of that seem to happen a lot, and they have a difficult time with organized sports. Not all the time, but a lot of the time. Social isolation and employment problems, because they don't really know what to do. They don't know what to focus on in terms of employment. Not many people hire people that enjoy doing video games all the time. Unfortunately, some of our guys like to do video games so much. They have a difficult time with that. This, of course, impacts family relationships. If they don't know how to date, just because I like you and I'm following you and I call you all the time, doesn't mean that you should be turned off from me. You should like me as much as I like you. And if you smile at me, then you must like me. Those types of situations. And again, they don't know how to know the difference between a social and a work relationship. They don't necessarily recognize boundaries, unless, of course, all these things are taught to them and practiced and taught to them early. So they end up sitting at home. They don't really have many healthy activities for themselves to do in terms of exercise, and they spend a lot of time with some sort of video function. I mentioned some of this because the reason why I developed and I wrote Healthy Relationships to begin with was primarily because many of the things that I saw in prison could have been avoided if they'd been taught those specific skill sets earlier. And it's not a fault of a parent or a fault of a school necessarily, but these individuals, parents are relieved that they've got a good IEP now. You know, they're just becoming young teens. Things are going fairly well with them. They may maybe a friend or two, or at least that's what it appears to be, and there's no real problems. So finally, the parent gets to sit back and relax a little bit. Well, the school says, well, you've got some language, you're doing okay. They don't pay much attention. And yet there's all kinds of little things that will occur that they drive them crazy. They do become interested in what their peers are doing. Their peers all seem to be going out with each other, doing other activities. Or because of some of their sensory problems, which everybody knows about, but don't really recognize what it is. How often do you hear about the subtle bullying that goes on in places like that, where somebody that's very sensitive to sound has something like this going on your chair behind you right before a test is given in a class? Teacher has to get up and take the individual out again. Well, it's not really the fault of the individual with autism. It's, of course, the bully that sat behind him, but no one saw the bully, at least the teacher didn't. And of course, the child with autism gets picked on and bullied. So I wrote this to kind of illustrate some of the things that could happen to these individuals, the traps that they could fall into, but also interventions that can make them better. One of my concerns with doing this was there were skill sets that need to be present, at least on a common level. So last week's session dealt with basic human or hygiene, individual hygiene, making sure our hair was washed, use of deodorant, washing hands, brushing teeth, at least at a minimum level, so that they got it and understood it. There's actually many more lessons associated with it than that, but that was the basics for there. And they had a basic understanding of biological sexuality. They could identify the parts of a male and a female. They had a basic understanding of what these parts were. They had a basic understanding of conception and childbirth. It's all very basic and fairly straightforward. With that kind of a basis, then being an adolescent or a young adult, there was a myriad of type of activities that we needed to work with. Typically, those first two modules, the one for hygiene, the one for human sexuality, these were considered like a minimum baseline. They were typically 4 sessions long. We would see people average once a week in a group. So these guys have been together for a while. We start beginning to develop skill sets on how to interact with another. How do you make a friend? What's the difference between a friend and an acquaintance? What's the difference between a friend and a bully? If somebody gives you something, are they a friend? If you have a special thing that's going on with you, should you share it with the mailman? Should you tell the principal? Should you tell the classroom? I had a young woman that was in one of my first classes, and she had a way of telling her teacher, or me in this case, all that was going on with her life at the time. Unfortunately, every time her menstrual cycle came, she would announce it to the teacher across the room. So everybody in the room would hear it. That was very awkward. By the time 3 or 4 months went by, I recognized that she wasn't doing it anymore. Her mother came up to me and she says, "Do you know, when you started that lesson on private talk, all of a sudden, we talked about who should know about these things, and she doesn't go broadcasting it anymore." Well, that wasn't my specific intention with her when I talk about what's private and who do you share private things with and who is it good to confide in and who are those people in your life. It's like a circles type of curriculum. Like in the center are the people that you really trust, that you can talk with and share things with. The next circle out, maybe acquaintances, people that are nice to you. Maybe they're friends of your parents. Maybe they're friends of your siblings. And then, of course, in the outside are the bullies, people that take advantage of you, even though sometimes they seem to be nice to you. These are the types of things that we would move into next. Some of the concerns that I have, if I'm talking too fast, somebody put it in the chat so Father Dustin can slow me down. So some of the concerns that I have, lack of recognition of how to meet people and to carry on simple and novel conversations, like the notion of small talk. If you've ever been to Disney World and you stand in those long lines, well, what's the point of small talk? Does it make any sense? usually it makes no sense. You're talking about the weather, you're talking about whatever, unless something dramatic's going on, but you're probably not going to be standing in a line there. So I use the example, if you're standing in one of those long lines with a girl that you just met, and you don't talk, and you're in line for 15 minutes, is she going to want to be on a ride with you again? She's not going to want to stand there if you're not going to try to talk or to keep a conversation going. So I try to make it more relevant to what they're doing at the time. And small talk's hard. It's just something that you have to learn. We practice it. It seems silly. It seems stupid in many regards to them, but they practice it with one another. And then we practice what are the situations where small talk is important. When might you do that? Do you do it in the middle of church? Probably not. Do you do it when you're standing in line for something? Well, sure. Do you do it during lunchtime or cafeteria time? Other times like that, and we talk about when it's appropriate. They have a general lack, as I just recently mentioned, of understanding of who a friend is and who are people that one can trust to share personal information with. I do something that's a little bit different in my groups that I run. I ask them to identify what I refer to as a confederate. It could be a parent, but what I try to get them to do, in addition to your parents, who else do you trust that you can tell most anything to? And they'll come up with somebody. It could be an aunt or an uncle, it could be an older sibling, it could be a friend of the family. It's important to have someone that if you get into a situation where you can't find your parents and you want to check something, you want to do it. The example that I use, all the kids are jumping in the car to go to McDonald's. I'd really like to go with them, and they've invited me to go with them. Mom and dad aren't home. Well, if you practice calling your confederate and literally do the practicing of it, you call and you tell her, all these kids are going. Well, who's going? He names all the people that are going. Well, wasn't Jimmy the boy that teased you pretty badly last week? Bullied you? Oh, yeah. Well, do you think it's a good idea that you go with this group away? Maybe not this time. And it helps them to really see the bigger picture with a little bit of additional help. And I apologize for using he all the time. It could be he or she. My generalizations are basically looking at the individual. How do you make and keep friends? How do you make and keep adult friends? What is the difference between a friend and an adult friend? Is there any? What do adult friends do for socialization? Do they only go to a bar? Or what else could they do? Do I have to be married to somebody to do social things as an adult? How do I use social media, and particularly the internet? One of the sadder things that I spend a lot of time doing is I work as an expert witness for the federal public defender. Some individuals, because they get introduced to the internet, may find something on the internet that attracts them. As you may know, that any single picture of child pornography is considered a felony. So it could be 1, it could be 10, it could be whatever. And they get caught by the FBI typically. I've had situations where the FBI has come to me and said, this person was looking at pornography. There was some child pornography on there, and we arrested him. But comparatively speaking, his number of pictures that he had that we found on all of his devices was tiny compared to the typical sexual offender we might come in contact with. We don't really want to put him into the population with these other people. Can you help us understand what he really needs to help it so he doesn't do this again? One of the very sad things that I learned when I worked in the prison was that some of my individuals with autism, when they're housed with somebody for 18 months, and you're with the same people all the time, and that was the minimum length of stay for people in this particular unit, they become your new best friends. And so what these individuals were doing was they would sit in groups together, they would talk about their offenses, and all of a sudden my individuals with autism, when they talked about their offenses, had more offenses. They were taking on what these other people were describing as if they were his or her own, or his own in that case, of how they would hurt other people. They were learning other skill sets of how to hurt people from their new best friends. So there's a very distinct reason not to incarcerate them, at least with the regular population. You need to be accountable for what you've done, but where you're placed, you want to teach them replacement behaviors to meet their needs in ways that don't hurt other people, and that they're not using things like child pornography, for example. And that was very, very apparent in the one facility that I worked with for a number of years. And the internet it's curious. Number of the men that I worked with, when they look at child pornography, I would ask them, what happened to you at age, whatever it was? It could have been a 5-year-old, it could have been an 8-year-old. Tell me what your life was at that point. Inevitably, not everyone, but almost everyone identified a time when they were assaulted. And they didn't describe it as an assault, but they told me who hurt them at that point in time, which I thought was astonishing. So when they come across an image, they're kind of stuck there because that was their first experience with some form of human sexuality. Many of these individuals don't understand personal space and boundaries. They don't just get close to people. They don't just interrupt people. They don't just talk really loud because they don't know what they're supposed to do. If one were to take the time to show typical situations or to practice typical situations with them, or how far should I stand between people, even if somebody cuts in front of you. It's like when you're driving a car, you should have so much space between you and the car in front of you when you're on a highway, for example. Somebody inevitably will cut you off. Do you back it up? Do you slow it down rather, or do you do something different? Or do you just hit the horn? Well, in part, we're trying to demonstrate or practice, what are some of these things we should do? What is typical personal space when I'm in a room with somebody, at a party with somebody, in church? What type of voice should I use when I'm inside versus outside? How do I show affection to somebody, either family members or a close friend or just a friend? When is it appropriate to show more affection? And what is affection? Is affection holding hands, putting my arm around somebody, kissing somebody on the cheek or on the lips? Is it ever appropriate for some of these, or when is it appropriate? Dating. What's a date? And I got fabulous answers for this because I had no real idea. They would watch TV to see what dates are in order to give some sort of an answer. Well, how do you know if you're ready to date somebody? And they would kind of just look at me, well, I like her. That's why I want to date with her. What do you do in a date? And they all just stare at me, typically the first time I go through this type of an example. And that's where I come to the point of 44 questions. I'm going to stop sharing this screen for a second, go to a second to demonstrate one of my favorite exercises. After these individuals in my groups have been together now for 10, 12, 18 lessons, which is a very long time, I have them sit back to back with each other. And I'll just go through the first couple, then we don't need to go through all 44. How long have you known the person that's sitting behind you? Have you ever talked to them before outside of the group? What color are their eyes? This is where they get stuck. What color is their hair? What's their last name? Where does the person live? Do they have siblings? Their heads inevitably just drop because they don't really know the person that they've been sitting next to for all these weeks and weeks and weeks, because they're typically egocentric. The world revolves around me. It doesn't revolve around, interaction with other people around them. We're all ready to go to an amusement park, but we had to stop because my mother got sick. She got sick on purpose because she didn't want me to go to the amusement park. I know that had to be the case. Well, because everything is centered around me. So it makes it problematic. Okay, I'm going to go back to my, I'm going to stay here, I think, if I can. Yeah, I may not be able to. As my screen flips, okay. Each of the lessons that we put together raise different ideas of how to make new friends. I can do that one here with a poster. They give you, it's a specific lesson. And in the lesson, we use the first time you meet somebody, what color are they likely to be in? Red means absolutely stop, or bully, or somebody that you really don't know well enough to give information to. Green is somebody that you know really well. We use the concept of a traffic light because it's familiar to them extensively, just to kind of show what some of these examples could be. Things in the middle might be people like acquaintances. But if I want to meet somebody and make it a friend of them, how long do I know them? I'll refer back to the 44 questions. the funny thing, after we did it, and it happens every time, but particularly after the first time where it was so dramatic to me, once we finished and got done with it, and I saw how many they got right, which was only a couple, they started interviewing each other. I thought it was really important that if you're going to be my friend, I got to know a lot about you. Well, if I'm going to make a new friend or an adult friend, what are the skill sets necessary to make a friend? What's that information I need to know? Well, not ironically, those 44 questions give you that kind of an idea of what it is for a person to make a friend. If that makes any sense. All right, I am going to go back. And each of the one of them, by the way, has a pre and a post test so that you have an idea, so you can measure progress. Is this individual actually understanding? Are they able to do it? Okay, put this off, share screen again, come back to here, share this. Okay. We have a pre-test, we have a check for understanding to see if they get it. And I think one of the most important parts for me is the role playing and practicing and modeling by others. You know, an adult with another adult can make such an impression. This is how we deal with people in a dignified fashion. This is what we say. You know, we don't have to swear at everything. We can, you know, make these types of comments. This is how I dress. This is how I act when I'm tired. You know, knowing emotions, knowing different states of being are very difficult for them to understand. So people get so upset when they don't make eye contact with another individual. I worked at a school for the deaf where we taught children how to speech read. I do the same thing with adolescents and adults. If I get you to pay attention to the lips of somebody that's talking to you, then I'm actually acknowledging you as a speaker. If I look at your eyes could be telling me all kinds of things. You could be sad, you could be happy, you could be very angry, you could be depressed, you could be any number of things. They can't tell very well. So if I look at somebody's eyes, and I've had parents when they come to an evaluation say, look at the doctor, make sure that you tell them everything. And they're staring at me, but it's like this blank stare that I can't get any information from them. I try to get the parents to slow it down a bit and say, just if they can answer the questions, that's the best. And when they begin to talk to me, they may be looking outside the window, they may be looking at something else, but I'm getting a full answer from them almost every time. Because some people want to make sure, guards in particular, that you're looking at me and you're giving me respect, teach them to speech read or teach them to look at the person's lips instead of their eyes. Oftentimes it takes the pressure off of it and they can typically respond, particularly older and higher functioning individuals. Pardon the use of the higher functioning term. We try to track what they do. We try to do post-test. And then we come back and we measure afterwards how much they retained. And this is typically 6 months after the group. It's found out to, for me, it's found out to be a fairly useful series of exercises and tools. One of the problems I had was stopping it. Every time a new situation would come up, we'd make a new set of lessons, which is why the relationship development part. You know, what is private talk? What's personal talk? How do I use the internet? What is a typical date? What's a good place to date that an individual might go? These types of things. When one's teaching, it's really important to use visuals, to try to do limited amount of talk and to talk slowly, not nearly as fast as I'm talking, to role play whenever it's possible so that they have a concrete example of somebody doing something, to highlight the important information. Modeling, of course, is so very important. In time for processing and responses. You know, I know the time's coming down a little bit, but what I'd like to do is just a real quick example from, I believe it was the first lecture. When I evaluated a child when he was 5 years old, he had an intellectual quotient of 64. When he got to be 17, when they applied for Social Security disability, which can, with a variety of factors, can happen with an IQ of 70 or less, he was retested by another licensed person who found his IQ at that point, using a different test, had gone from 74 to the low 70s, or from 64 to the low 70s. It was higher, but it was close enough to 70, and his overall functioning was still low. He was granted Social Security disability. At the age of 21, when he aged out of public education, the Office of Vocational Rehabilitation, which is the state agency in Pennsylvania, it's actually a federal program, said, you have decent language. Looks like you might be able to work. We'd like to evaluate you to see what type of work you do. They evaluated him for the third time, an adult IQ test. All the tests were considered valid. He had an IQ of 94, which is 2 standard deviations higher than the first set of tests. My hypothesis on that is that individuals with autism often take information in, they try to process it and understand it, and then they come back out with a response. When they're younger and don't understand the processes, it takes a very long time. As they get older, I think the higher scores in his case may have been the fact that he was processing information faster, not that he was brighter, because intelligence doesn't work that way. You get a good, accurate test, it should be fairly close, within a couple of points. You can get a low score because of a headache, or because of your partner or somebody was fighting with you before you took the test, or you didn't sleep good the night before, you had something bad to eat. There's a lot of reasons to get low tests. High tests, really, if it's accurate, aren't possible except with this possible explanation. So processing is really important. And when you teach, try not to use these types of terms. It's raining cats and dogs, or sarcasm. They don't really, one of my seminarians just this week, I got caught on because I used a type of sarcasm that was very subtle, and he kind of just looked at me, and the other guys really quickly explained to him what was going on. This young man is doing fabulously in the seminary. I slip sometimes, and I was caught on it a bit, and he knew that I was trying to joke with him a little bit. Because of the time, I wanted to leave some time for questions. I can go into real world types of things or other lessons and videos, but how about if I see, Father Dustin, if there are questions or things that people might want to be asking?
Yes, thank you, Dr. Sutton. This was well, let's see. No, that was Lawrence had to leave us. And let's see, let me scroll down here. So Kathy asks, as a minister in prison who is not a psychologist, what can I do to help these people do better in society? Should we try to do the same things that you are teaching? So as a prison minister.
I think you can do some of the things. What is it that they would like to do? What is it that you can help them? What got them into trouble? Again, these are individuals that you suspect or know that are in the autism spectrum. They often want to please people in authority. Once they've gained your trust, which doesn't take very much, for better or for worse, they'll do essentially what you ask them to do. So if you want to practice, they get very angry. And when they get angry at somebody, they want to punch them or they want to break something. What's another way that we can express our anger right now that won't get you in that kind of trouble? Well, people that aren't incarcerated, I would say, if you have newspaper, take old newspaper, rip it up. That's physically something to do. Do something that's physical. One of my seminarians, as an example, was very bright, but he had a fiery temper. I said, there's a lot of wood outside, and the monks had a fire pit. I said, can you chop wood? You should see the monstrosity that he'd end up building because of the amount of wood that he chopped, because he went out there frequently for several years, and that was his way of burning it off. It's hard to do that, of course, in a prison as well, but you can feel out from the individual what it is that got them into trouble. How else can they meet their needs? Let's talk about it here. Don't use a lot of words, but perhaps in groups, perhaps in socialization, perhaps in reentry types of programs, you can help facilitate something very specific and unique to that person's individual needs using some of these techniques. Again, sometimes people look at some of the lessons and say, well, that's fairly simple. Of course it is. It's not rocket science, but you have to think in those terms. It's logical, it's very concrete, and it's very specific with what you're trying to do. If you try to make it really complicated and use lots of words to describe it, because that's what we're all used to, the person's going to be lost and they're not going to hear most of what you say. If you begin step by step on doing, is there something else that you could do making rope? Is there something else we can make with it instead of making ropes? Can we make a wreath of some sort? He was so creative with stuff, but he had the wrong people asking him for things to do. What else could we make? If you like to draw, could you make things for me as we talk? A lot of times the expression comes out in an art type of a format for them, which can be very useful. I hope that helps a little bit. Much of it, and I will say this, the email, my email here is on the end. I skipped some of this, well, that's okay. Somebody wrote me after the first one, and I wrote back to ask, can you give me a specific example? And unfortunately, he didn't. Please give me a little bit of information. I'll be very happy to write you back. And for better or for worse, I do that. I'll write back in detail a response of how I might respond to something, if that's helpful at all. Again, it's looking at it from a different logical perspective.
So, yeah, there's one other question here, but before we get to that, Dr. Sutton, I was just trying to think in terms of where I serve in the state of Florida. We have these large confinement dorms of men in solitary confinement, and most of them have mental health issues. And a lot of what you've described sounds somewhat, not even vaguely, actually quite familiar with just some of the dynamics. And I was thinking to myself, I'm not even sure the DOC here would have a screening process really to segregate or to house individuals on the spectrum in a place where their care would be perhaps more intentional than in other areas. And I'm just thinking of how many times they misinterpret, miscommunicate with guards, and then they get a disciplinary charge from that. So
I was able to do an experiment at the prison I worked at, and we realized that there were so many individuals in that particular facility. We ended up separating the group by younger and older that were in the spectrum, and all the others in this program were separated in two other buildings. The guards that were there thought it was such an easy place to work. Before they got there, they all bid on it. It was a union-based facility. They came up to me like a month afterwards and saying, this is the hardest job I've ever done, because there's no aggression, there's no fighting, there's nothing like that. They're hanging all over me. They're talking to me. It's so emotionally draining every day. And this is these hardcore type of guards. And ironically, what they ended up doing from the facility, even though it was a specialized program, any individual with autism was actually sent to the program. We had a young man that every time he got excited or upset, he would bite. His hands were ugly because he would bite his hands, he'd bite his wrist. And if you pushed him to try to stop, he'd bite you. Well, you had time and time and time threw on him because of it. Through various types of techniques, we did two things. We put him into the program where everything was systematized. The routine was regular. They knew what to predict. And we did a technique that isn't the best in the long run, but it was fabulously successful, is that every time he got anxious or upset, because my staff overheard it once, they threw chewing gum at him. And because his biting was an oral motor way of dealing with his anxiety. And so if he's chewing gum, he's not going to chew himself. And of course, curiously, within a month, his arms and hands were clear. He bit only once, and that was right before he was to be discharged when the placement fell through. It was one bite, but it was fabulous because we taught him alternatives to express his anxiety. But we had to buy time, and the chewing gum bought me time to do that. Sorry, it was just as Karen said, I drift off on stories all the time.
No, you're good. Well, I appreciate that. We have another question here from Kathy, and she asks, she says, I have heard that a huge percentage of people in prison have fetal alcoholism. If you're familiar with it, can you explain how it is different than autism?
I think some of the treatments are similar. I don't know the numbers of individuals that are in the prisons. And I think part of that is because it's not screened beforehand. Your opening question about the screening is very sadly true, at least in my own state. There may be, in the state adult prison system, there may have been 15 PhDs. In the juvenile system, that was just me. I had a lot of people with master's degrees, it's good. It's not to diminish their helpfulness. This type of autism work is very specialized. It's not hard, but it's very specialized. How are you going to diagnose it, let alone do interventions with so few especially specifically trained treatment personnel. You can train others. This isn't rocket science again, but it is specialized and you do need specific training. Once they get it, it's easy and you can generalize it to the individual specific needs, but it's recognizing it to begin with. I've had attorneys call me, my client, he's going to Camp Hill, which is Pennsylvania's diagnostic unit. They don't know that he's autistic and I'm afraid that they're going to miss it. They miss it because they don't have somebody that really knows to look for it. You can do tests or you can do developmental history. Developmental history, of course, is the best, but if you get older individuals, sometimes parents aren't living or you don't have that information, so you rely on the tests that exist. But it's very possible to do it. The advantage is that you'll have a better insight in terms of why they're doing something or not doing something, why they're compliant in certain areas and why they're not in other areas. As I found out in my own system when I did it, there was no assaults, there was nothing. I mean, it was a very pleasant atmosphere to be in, even though it was emotionally draining for everybody that worked there. But those kids got better. Those individuals got better. I say everybody's a kid. I don't know.
So any other questions, and feel free to also unmute yourself if you do have a question. We have just a few folks here with us, so I think we can do that, or feel free to add it into the chat box.
Care to yell at us, but
here we go.
Are there other questions or specifics? Now, one doesn't have to use this program. There's all kinds of ideas that can work. The idea is the process of what's involved. You find a problem that somebody has, you find out if you, in effect, I'm talking about conducting a quasi-functional behavioral assessment on an individual. What are the things that lead up to them exploding or getting upset or doing what they're doing? And then how can you intervene? And what's a replacement behavior for that? Mm-hmm. Most individuals with autism, when they get upset and they get to the point of no return, like somebody in a rage, they're going to do exactly what they did last time. You can talk about alternatives and they'll tell you after the fact, oh yeah, I could have done this or I could have done that. But at the time, if you've not practiced the replacement behavior, once you practice it, it becomes a real thing that they can do because they'll practice it. And then that situation comes, they'll look at you and they'll do the other behavior, the one that you've been practicing. And then hopefully you'll reinforce it with a lot of positive stuff. That becomes their new behavior. At least it seems to have always been the case, or nearly always the case in the facilities that I've worked at. I know it sounds almost too good to be true, except that they don't want to be there. And they want to please you once they've befriended you. So I hope it's been a little bit useful. It's really sad to see some of these individuals there. The other reason I wrote it is it's good primary prevention. If some of these things are done in early adolescence, which it's done a lot in Pennsylvania now through this, you can really help recognize when things are happening or what something might mean and teach different skill sets. Mm-hmm. Adolescence is the time when so many different things can happen. And if you don't intervene, either their peers or the internet is going to be their teachers on what to do socially. And that's kind of frightening in a lot of ways. And if people don't really talk to them, and lots of people do not, I mean, there's so many people in need. And a lot of times these individuals are loners. They can develop a lot of other problems. And depression and anxiety is very severe then, particularly by the time they get to be 15 or 16 with many. And your expressions of depression, particularly if you get angry, can be very dramatic.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Sutton, for for your ministry and for the work that you're doing for countless, folks that are in need of someone to understand and to see them, and to hopefully encourage others to be able to see them. And that's what I would hope. While I hope you have opportunities to speak at many of our state Department of Corrections and different places, so that many others could see and to be aware of the needs here. So we have just a few announcements. One major announcement, which is coming up here on Tuesday, November 1st at 7:30 p.m. We will be having our special event, Reclaiming Wholeness. Reclaiming Wholeness is an exploration of addiction, recovery, community, and spirituality. Through this conversation, Catholic Prison Ministry Coalitions provides a platform for chaplain ministers, loved ones, community members, and those that are in recovery to become compassionately aware and gain a deeper understanding of the issues surrounding addiction and incarceration. The four voices at this event will have Jim Wahlberg and Evelyn Duhart of Ignatian Spirituality Project, Lisa De Lara of Just, J-U-S-T, and our host will be His Eminence Cardinal Joseph Tobin. So please join us on this Tuesday at 7:30 p.m. for this very important webinar. And it's almost, I'm not even sure to call it a webinar, Karen. It's more of a panel discussion, and feel free to visit the website for more information on that as well. And then we also have a Holding Still update. This is the documentary produced by Prison Contemplative Fellowship and premiered in partnership with CPMC. This is a documentary on centering prayer and the spiritual journey, with two men from the film will join Lizzie as they talk about new tools and resources to encourage engagement with centering prayer and the practice's power to process shame and trauma. The time for that, Karen, what is that? What's the time for that and the date? Oh wait, it's right in front of me. Of course. Yeah, November 3rd. Yeah, I see it on the screen here now. Thursday, November 3rd, 1 p.m. Eastern. And that'll be, again, this discussion on prison contemplative outreach and centering prayer. And then finally, our next webinar will be on racism. And so join us for a presentation by Dr. Patrick St. Jean's, a Jesuit, including a discussion of his book, The Crucible of Racism, Ignatian Spirituality and the Power of Hope. Upon coming to the United States to pursue graduate studies and then to embark on training as a Jesuit, the Haitian-born Patrick discovered something he had not known before: racism. To these experiences, Dr. St. Jean applies the basic principles of Jesuit formation, the discernment of spirits, the examination of conscience, the imaginative identification with Jesus in his sufferings, death, and resurrection. These principles and practices, he concludes, hold promise of conversion, healing, and resurrection for a church and society still caught in the crucible of racism. So that'll be Wednesday, November 9th at 1 p.m. And finally, I have one other announcement here, and that is an event here on, is it post-abortion healing? Right, November 17th at 1 p.m. The causes and effects of abortion are steeped in various forms of trauma. As ministers of the gospel, it is incumbent upon us to adopt a posture of humility and accompaniment when we encounter an individual who has been impacted by this reality. Join this town hall with Dr. Martha Shuping to learn more about the topic of abortion as it relates to incarceration, addresses grief that men and women may experience post-abortion, and offers other vital approaches to being ministers of healing and restoration. That's November 17th at 1 p.m. And just a reminder too, thank you, Karen, for our webinar on racism, is also an acknowledgement that November is Black Catholic Month. So please feel free to check out the website for more information on all of these different webinars, opportunities, again, to continue to further educate ourselves on all the issues surrounding incarceration and post-incarceration. And we pray a blessing upon Dr. Sutton for your ministry. May God continue to bless you and all of those that you serve, both in prison and in seminaries as well. So thank you for all the extraordinary work that you are doing for our church and for our communities. And a blessing upon all of those here present tonight and all of your different ministries, all the lives that you all touch, for all the work you're doing in bringing up the kingdom of God. So may God bless you all in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. Amen. And good night.